The night skies above Shimal Valley were an endless ocean of black and silver, the kind of darkness that swallows sound and bends light. The wind screamed against the rotors of the UH-60 Black Hawk as it tore through the narrow canyon, slicing the air at barely 200 feet above the jagged Afghan mountains. Inside, 10 soldiers sat strapped to the steel benches, U.S. Army Rangers, hardened and silent, faces painted in streaks of ash and camouflage. Among them sat Sergeant Elena Ward, one of the few women ever to complete the Elite Ranger qualification course. She'd done it not for fame, not for recognition, but to prove that fear could be mastered. Now, on this freezing night, fear was the only companion she could feel pressing against her ribs. Her mission was simple. On paper, extract an embedded intelligence operative who had gone dark after tracking a Taliban convoy transporting U.S.-made weapons. But in Afghanistan, simple didn't exist. Nothing was ever predictable in the valley. Not the wind, not the terrain, and certainly not the enemy. 2 minutes out, the crew chief shouted over the roar. Elena gave a tight nod. Her gloved hand checked her rifle. M4 carbine, suppressor attached, sight adjusted. Every movement was mechanical, drilled from years of training. Across from her, Sergeant First Class Reeves, the team leader, met her eyes. He didn't have to speak. His look said everything. We're ready. Stay sharp. The chopper banked sharply left, and the canyon walls seemed to close in. Then the night erupted. A streak of orange ripped through the dark, an RPG. It slammed into the tail section with a deafening explosion, sending the aircraft spiraling violently. Metal screamed, the floor tilted, and everyone was thrown sideways. Reeves grabbed for the straps, shouting, "Brace! Brace!" Elena tried to hold on, but the centrifugal force ripped her hand from the strap. The side door burst open from the shockwave, and a violent gust of wind yanked her into the open air. For one suspended heartbeat, time froze. She saw the helicopter's underbelly spinning above her, sparks cascading into the night like burning snow. Her breath tore from her lungs. The blackness below was endless. There was no parachute, no backup plan, just the cold wind and the sickening pull of gravity. The fall lasted seconds, but in her mind, it stretched into eternity. She remembered her father's voice, the one who taught her how to climb cliffs back in Montana. "Don't look down, kid. The ground will always be there. Focus on what's next." Now, as she hurtled toward that very ground, his words echoed like prophecy. She spread her arms and legs wide, stabilizing her fall, shifting her pack to act as a buffer. Training kicked in, instinct overriding panic. She wasn't falling. She was calculating. The canyon slope angled sharply below, a dry riverbed filled with sand and rock. It wasn't soft, but it was better than the cliff face. Her eyes watered from the freezing wind. She counted seconds, 3, 4, 5, then hit. The impact was an explosion of pain. Her shoulder dislocated on impact. Her breath vanished, and darkness slammed into her like a wall. For a long time, she didn't move. Didn't even know if she could. When she finally gasped awake, she was lying on her back, half buried in sand and gravel. The helicopter was nowhere in sight. Only the faint echo of distant gunfire rolled down the canyon walls. Her right arm throbbed with fire. She could barely breathe. She tried to move and cried out softly. Her ribs were likely cracked. Slowly, with gritted teeth, she rolled onto her side, coughing dust from her lungs. Her helmet had cracked in half. Her radio hung uselessly. Antenna snapped. She checked her utility belt, her combat knife, flashlight, and a small medical pouch. Everything else was gone. She was alone. The wind whistled through the canyon, carrying distant voices, not American. Enemy patrols may be searching the wreck. She forced herself to crawl toward a cluster of rocks and wedged herself into the shadow. Every breath stabbed like a blade in her chest. The world tilted in and out of focus. Her mind screamed for rest, but training screamed louder. You stop, you die. She used her uninjured arm to open her med pouch. There was morphine inside, but she hesitated. Pain meant she was alive. She wrapped a bandage around her ribs, tightened her sling, and bit down until her jaw ached. Above her, the stars glimmered coldly, indifferent to her suffering. Minutes passed, or hours. She couldn't tell. The helicopters returned overhead, sweeping spotlights across the canyon. Her heart leaped. She wanted to wave, scream, do anything to signal them. But if the enemy saw her light first, she'd be dead before rescue arrived. So she stayed still, hidden beneath a jagged overhang, clutching her knife like a talisman. The choppers passed. Their lights faded. Silence returned. It was a different kind of silence, heavy, suffocating. Elena realized something horrifying. Command probably thought she hadn't survived the fall. It would log her as Kia. Search for the others. Leave her behind. She pressed her forehead to the dirt and closed her eyes, feeling the raw edge of panic creep in. For the first time in years, tears burned behind her lids, not from fear, but from rage. Rage at the randomness of it all, at the thought that she might die forgotten in this wasteland. She forced herself to breathe slow, focus. Her fingers found the small laminated card tucked inside her uniform. The Ranger Creed, the same card every Ranger carried from day one. She unfolded it with trembling hands, tracing each line with her dirty fingertips. The words felt heavier now, like scripture carved into her bones. Recognizing that I volunteered as a ranger, fully knowing the hazards of my chosen profession. She smiled bitterly. Yeah, she knew the hazards. But she'd never planned on going out like this. Never shall I leave a fallen comrade. That line pierced her heart. Reeves, the others. They were still out there, somewhere in the valley. Alive or dead, she didn't know. But she couldn't help them lying here. The thought angered her. She tore strips from her uniform to fashion a crude sling and checked her surroundings. The canyon stretched north toward a thin ridge. If she could climb high enough by dawn, she might spot the crash site or an extraction point. Her body screamed in protest, but she ignored it. Pain was the cost of survival. Every movement was agony. Her legs trembled with each step, her boots slipping on gravel. She climbed on hands and knees, dragging herself up the incline until her vision blurred. When she reached the top, she collapsed beside a dead tree stump, gasping. Below, far off in the valley, orange flames flickered, the helicopter wreck. She whispered softly, "I'm coming." Her voice was barely audible against the wind, but in that moment, it wasn't a cry for help. It was a vow. Somewhere behind those burning hills, her team might still be fighting. If not, she'd carry their mission alone. That was what Rangers did. The moonlight glinted off the cracked surface of her rifle as she cradled it across her chest. She was broken, bruised, half-conscious, but alive. The fall hadn't ended her story. It had only rewritten the beginning. As the desert night grew colder, Sergeant Elena Ward pressed her back to the stone. Eyes fixed on the distant flames, whispering the words that had carried generations of soldiers through hell and home again. Rangers lead the way. The sun rose like fire over the Shamal Valley, painting the stone ridges in gold and blood. Sergeant Elena Ward opened her eyes to the blinding light and the cruel truth that her nightmare hadn't ended. Every inch of her body screamed in pain. Her ribs felt like shattered glass. Her right arm burned from a torn muscle, and her lips were cracked and bleeding. The chill of the night had faded, replaced by the merciless Afghan heat. For a long while, she just lay there beneath the crooked ridge, watching a hawk circle lazily above. Its shadow moved silently over the rocks, free, effortless. She envied that bird more than she ever thought she could. But freedom, she reminded herself, doesn't come from wings. It comes from will. With a groan, she pushed herself upright. Her back scraped against the stone, and white-hot pain flared through her chest. She bit down hard, refusing to cry out. Sound was dangerous here. Sound could get her killed. The world around her was alive, not with safety, but with the constant hum of danger. Far below, she could hear faint engines. Not American. The deep, uneven growl of pickup trucks, insurgent patrols combing the valley for survivors. The crash site must have drawn every hostile within 10 miles. Her instincts screamed one command: move. She gathered what little she had: a knife, a cracked canteen with a mouthful of water, the remains of her medical pouch, and her M4 rifle, its sight shattered but barrel intact. She took a long look at the horizon. To the east lay the burning wreck, too dangerous to approach. To the north stretched an endless maze of cliffs and shadowed ravines. Somewhere up there, she hoped, was safety, or at least distance. She chose the north. Each step was agony. The sand shifted beneath her boots, and the wind cut her skin raw. The silence of the valley was deceptive. It wasn't peace, it was hunting ground silence. Every echo could be a voice. Every rock could hide a rifle. After an hour of slow, cautious movement, she reached a narrow gully and collapsed inside its shade. The ground was cool, the air still. She used her knife to pry open a small first aid packet, smearing antiseptic on her wounds. The sting nearly made her pass out, but the pain meant the infection hadn't won yet. She needed water, food, shelter. Without those, she wouldn't survive the next night. Elena scanned the canyon walls for signs of life. A patch of green moss caught her eye, moisture. She crawled to it, following the thin trickle of water that seeped from the rocks. It wasn't much, but it was something. She cupped her hands, sipped slowly, and forced herself not to drink too fast. Every drop mattered. Then she heard it: voices. Male, harsh, speaking Pashto. Close, she froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Carefully, she slid behind a cluster of stones, camouflaging herself with dust. Through a gap, she saw 3 men moving down the ridge, rifles slung over their shoulders, scanning the ground. One of them picked up a torn strap from a flight harness, hers. They were tracking her. Her throat tightened. She reached for her rifle, steadying her breath. Don't move. Don't make a sound. The men stopped, arguing quietly. One pointed toward the rocks where she hid. Her fingers tightened around the trigger. If they came closer, she'd have to fight, and fighting would mean noise. Noise would bring more. She aimed, ready to fire. Then, a sound saved her. Distant thunder. Not from the sky, but from rotors. Helicopters. The men looked up, shielding their eyes. U.S. aircraft sweeping the valley. The Taliban scattered, sprinting for cover. Elena lowered her rifle, her heart pounding with relief. She wanted to scream for help, to signal the choppers, but her mind cut the thought off immediately. The enemy was still nearby. If she gave away her position, she'd be dead before rescue ever came. The choppers passed overhead, their shadows crawling across the canyon walls. One lingered briefly, circling the crash site, before disappearing into the horizon. Silence returned, heavier than before. She exhaled slowly. The realization settled like a weight in her chest. They weren't coming for her. Command must have marked her dead. To them, she was already a name on a casualty report. The thought stung more than her wounds. But Elena Ward wasn't dead. Not yet. That night, she built a shelter from broken branches and stones near the gully's mouth. She camouflaged it with her torn parachute fabric, scavenged earlier from debris. It wasn't much, but it would keep her hidden from thermal imaging and cold desert air. The hours dragged on. The temperature plummeted. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to conserve body heat. The pain in her ribs made every breath a struggle. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled, echoing through the mountains like ghosts. She stared up at the stars, sharp, bright, and endless. For the first time, she allowed herself to think of home. Of the small ranch in Montana, where the wind never stopped but never felt hostile. Of her father's old workshop, the smell of oil and wood shavings. He'd always told her, if the world knocks you down, stand up before it realizes you're still breathing. She smiled weakly. Guess I'm standing up, Dad, she whispered. Her mind wandered, drifting between exhaustion and memory. She saw flashes of her unit. Reeves smirked before the mission, the nervous laughter of Private Henson, the steady hand of Doc Morales. Were they alive? Had they made it out? Or were their bodies burning with the wreck? Tears welled up, but she blinked them away. Crying wasted water. And she couldn't afford weakness. Not here, not now. She needed a plan. At dawn, she decided to move again. Staying put meant death. She climbed higher along the ridge, moving carefully to avoid skyline exposure. From the peak, she could see the valley spread out below. Winding roads, clusters of villages, and far in the distance, a column of smoke rising from a ridge. That had to be the crash site. She raised her broken binoculars, squinting through one intact lens. Movement, figures picking through the wreckage. Taliban scavengers. They were taking weapons, gear, and maybe worse, the bodies. Elena's stomach twisted. She wanted to scream, to run down there, to do something, anything. But she couldn't, not yet. She was one wounded ranger against dozens. Logic had to win over emotion. She turned away, scanning for alternate routes. That's when she noticed a faint glimmer in the dirt, metal fragments reflecting sunlight. She crouched and brushed the sand aside. It was part of a U.S. drone, small, mostly intact. The sight sparked an idea. If she could salvage the battery and antenna, she might be able to build a signal transmitter. Not powerful enough for long range, but maybe enough for short bursts. Enough to let command know she wasn't dead. She worked carefully, using her knife to pry loose the wiring. Hours passed under the unforgiving sun. Her fingers bled from effort, but she managed to rig a crude device from the drone's battery and her broken radio parts. It wasn't elegant, but neither was survival. By late afternoon, clouds began to roll over the peaks. The wind carried the faint smell of rain, rare but welcome. She pressed the improvised signal device against her lips and whispered a test transmission. ... Ranger 27 alive. Coordinates approximate. Need extraction. ... Over. Static answered. She tried again, voice cracking. Ranger 27. Still on mission. Nothing. Just static. Her shoulders slumped. She stared at the device, blinking back frustration. It might not even have enough power to reach the nearest base. But it was something. A start. Proof she hadn't given up. The first drops of rain fell, cold against her sunburned skin. She lifted her face toward the sky, letting them wash away the dust and sweat. It felt like the valley itself was acknowledging her fight. As the rain turned into a thin drizzle, Elena crouched beneath her shelter, holding the device to her chest like a lifeline. The storm's rumble drowned out the world, the first sound of peace she'd heard since the crash. Alone, broken, and stranded, Sergeant Elena Ward closed her eyes and made a silent promise. If they thought she was dead, she would make them remember her. If they stopped searching, she would give them a reason to start again. Because Rangers don't disappear. They endure. They adapt. And they always find their way back. By the time dawn broke again, Sergeant Elena Ward was no longer thinking about pain. She had moved past it, letting it become a dull, constant rhythm beneath her thoughts, a reminder that she was still alive. Her legs were trembling from exhaustion. Her ribs screamed with each breath, but her focus was razor sharp. She knew now where she was. Shamal Valley's northern edge, territory known among troops as the Black Veins, a labyrinth of cliffs, caves, and hidden trails perfect for insurgents, impossible for outsiders. And she was right in the middle of it. The storm had washed away her tracks, but it had also made the terrain more dangerous. The rocks were slick, the gullies deeper. Each step was a gamble. She moved like a ghost, her boots barely making a sound, her rifle always ready, though her bullets were few. Her plan was simple: move northeast toward an old American forward operating base marked on her mental map. It had been abandoned 2 years ago, but if she could reach it, she might find Combs' gear or supplies left behind. It was at least 20 miles through enemy territory. 20 miles of hell. By noon, the heat had returned, thick and merciless. Her tongue felt like sandpaper. The little water she had left was gone. She stopped beneath a rock ledge, sliding her back against the stone, and let herself rest for just a moment. Her eyes traced the horizon, endless dunes and shadows. Not a sign of life. Yet her instincts whispered otherwise. Something was watching. A flicker of movement. Just a shimmer, barely visible. She froze. A figure stood on the ridge above, motionless. Binoculars glinted in the sun. Then the shadow ducked away. Her pulse spiked. They were hunting her. Elena didn't wait to confirm. She tightened her pack straps and slipped into a narrow ravine, moving quickly but low. The canyon walls rose like prison bars on either side. She followed the winding path until the sound of running water reached her ears, a small stream cutting through the rock. Relief flooded her chest. She knelt, cupped the water, and drank greedily. The taste was metallic, but it was life itself. Then she saw it, boot prints in the mud. Not hers. Fresh. She froze mid-sip. 3 sets, moving east. The same direction she was headed. Her heart pounded. She wiped her mouth, lifted her rifle, and crouched low, scanning the shadows. The prints led around a bend, where the canyon widened into a small basin littered with debris, rusted fuel drums, scrap metal, and the burned remains of a vehicle. Smoke still rose faintly from it. She crept closer, every muscle tense. That's when she saw it, the shattered wing of a U.S. reconnaissance drone, half buried in sand. Her pulse quickened. The same type she had scavenged from before. She crawled to it, carefully checking for traps. None. The drone was badly damaged, but its casing was intact. She popped it open with her knife. Inside, the battery core still glowed faintly, and beside it, a broken camera module, complete with a small, partially working transmitter. A miracle. She packed the components quickly, securing them in her vest. Maybe she could strengthen her signal. Maybe she could make command hear her. But as she worked, she heard the crunch of gravel. Voices close. The same men whose tracks she'd followed. She flattened herself against the canyon wall, heartbeat thundering. Through the corner of her eye, she saw them. 3 militants in desert fatigues, rifles slung, scanning the ground. One spoke angrily, gesturing toward the drone wreck. Another bent down, examining fresh prints, hers. She realized with horror that she'd led them straight here. Her breath came shallow and silent. She slipped her hand to her knife, but fighting 3 men alone was suicide. She needed to vanish. Slowly, painfully, she began crawling backward, inch by inch through the sand. But one of the men turned suddenly, eyes narrowing. "Stop," he barked in Pashto. Elena didn't think. She moved. She rolled behind a rock, yanked her rifle up, and fired once. The bullet hit center mass, dropping the first man instantly. The others shouted and returned fire. Stone shattered around her. She darted sideways, sprinting toward the ravine. Bullets hissed past, one grazing her leg. She stumbled but didn't fall. She dove behind a ledge, pressed flat, and fired 2 more shots. One hit its mark. The second clipped a rock, sparking off harmlessly. The third man yelled something and fled toward the ridge. She didn't chase. She couldn't risk it. Her lungs burned, blood dripping down her thigh. She stayed hidden until silence returned, every sense alert. Then slowly she crawled out. 2 bodies lay still in the sand. The third had escaped. He would tell others. She had maybe hours before more came. Her survival had just become a race against time. She scavenged what she could, ammo, a radio, and a torn field map written in Arabic. Most of it was useless, but the radio. It had power. She turned it over in her hands. Its frequency range was short, but maybe, just maybe, she could piggyback her signal through their network. As the sun dipped lower, she limped toward a cave opening she spotted carved into the canyon wall. Inside, it was cool, dark, and dry. Safe enough for the night. She collapsed onto the dirt floor, chest heaving. Her hands trembled as she cleaned her wound and stitched the gash with shaking fingers. No anesthetic, just grit. Every pull of the thread made her vision blur, but she forced herself to finish. "Pain means you're not dead," she muttered under her breath. Afterward, she rested her head against the stone and turned on the enemy radio. Static, then faint chatter. Male voices distorted but clear enough to make out words. American woman. Valley North. Orders to find her alive. Alive. That single word chilled her blood. They didn't just want to kill her. They wanted her captured. Her jaw clenched. Not happening. She shut the radio off. The silence that followed was heavy, but she found comfort in it. Silence meant control, and control meant survival. As the night deepened, she pulled out her small transmitter. Using parts from the captured radio and the drone battery, she began to rebuild it, her hands steady despite exhaustion. She soldered wires using the heat from a bullet casing and a match. Improvised, primitive, but it worked. When she turned it on, a soft blue light flickered. She pressed the button and whispered, "Ranger 27. Still alive. Still on mission. North Shamal Valley, Black Vein Sector. Copy?" Static hissed. Then a faint click. A voice, distant, fractured by interference. ... repeat. ... Ranger? Her heart leapt. Yes. Ranger 27. Copy. Over. But before she could say more, the signal died. Battery drained. Silence again. She stared at the device, hands trembling with disbelief. Someone had heard her. The signal had reached them, even for a second. It meant she wasn't alone anymore. Command might now suspect the impossible, that the ranger they thought dead was still breathing. For the first time since the fall, Elena allowed herself to smile. Just a small one. She closed her eyes, letting exhaustion finally take her. Outside, the desert wind howled, and distant gunfire echoed across the cliffs, but she didn't flinch. Tomorrow, they would hunt her again. But tomorrow she would be ready. Because she was no longer just surviving, she was fighting back. And in the heart of enemy territory, Sergeant Elena Ward had just become the ghost every insurgent feared would return. When morning came, it painted the canyon walls in fire. The rising sun poured through cracks in the rock, glinting off Elena's rifle and casting long, jagged shadows around her. She woke instantly. No luxury of rest in enemy territory. Her instincts were sharp again. The fog of exhaustion burned away by a single thought. They knew she was alive. That changed everything. She packed her gears swiftly, checked her weapon, and re-wrapped her leg wound. A pain was there, but dulled. She could move again, slow but precise. Outside, the desert had turned from gold to white heat. She took one deep breath of the dry air, scanning the horizon. Somewhere out there, command had caught a whisper of her signal. If she could amplify it, they'd find her. But to do that, she needed a stronger power source, and those she could only find at a communications outpost. There was one she remembered from old recon maps, a Taliban relay station built inside an abandoned mining site about 15 miles northeast. Dangerous, heavily guarded, but it was her only chance. She started moving. The path wound through jagged stone and sun-scorched valleys. The silence was so absolute, she could hear her own pulse. Occasionally, she'd spot vultures circling in. The distance, reminders of how fragile survival really was out here. But she pushed forward, each step a test of her will. Around midday, she reached a ridge overlooking a narrow road, a dirt path barely wide enough for a single vehicle. A convoy was moving along it, 3 trucks filled with armed men. Her breath caught. They were heading northeast, the same direction she needed. She could follow them from a distance. They'd lead her straight to their base. She waited until they disappeared around a bend, then descended quietly, keeping to the rocks and dunes. Hours passed. Sweat ran into her eyes. Once she almost slipped, sending a cascade of gravel down the slope, but she froze instantly, pressing herself flat. A guard had stepped off one of the trucks to smoke. He scanned the ridge lazily, unaware that a wounded ranger lay watching him through a rifle scope less than 100 meters away. She could have shot him. She didn't. Her mission wasn't revenge, not yet. By dusk, the convoy reached the edge of the mining site. From her vantage point, Elena saw the outlines of rusted cranes, half-buried containers, and floodlights rigged to generators. The enemy had turned the mine into a fortress. Guards patrolled along catwalks, and antennas jutted up from the center tower. That was her target, the communications hub. She waited until nightfall. When darkness fell, she became a shadow. Every move was rehearsed from memory. The training that had been drilled into her for years resurfaced naturally. She slid down the ridge, crawled through thorny brush, and cut through the wire fence silently with her knife. Inside, she moved, low, avoiding the circles of light cast by the guards' lanterns. Her breath was steady, calm, controlled. She reached the tower's base and paused, listening. 2 guards stood by the generator, talking in low voices. One was lighting a cigarette. The other turned his back. Elena struck. In 2 precise moves, she incapacitated them. 1 blow to the throat, 1 choke hold from behind. Quick, clean, silent. She dragged their bodies into the shadows and took one's radio. Then she slipped into the tower. Inside, the air smelled of oil and dust. Old mining equipment lined the walls. In the corner, a control table buzzed faintly, the relay transmitter. She exhaled slowly, pulled the drone battery from her pack, and began wiring it to the system. Her hands were steady, her eyes flicking between readings. She calibrated the transmitter to the frequency command used back in the field, channel Delta 9. Then she pressed transmit. Ranger 27 to command, she whispered. Alive, northern sector. Request extraction. Silence. Then, static. Her heart sank. The antenna was too weak. She increased power output. Sparks hissed from the cables. The panel lights flickered red, threatening overload. She tried again, voice louder now. Command, this is Ranger 27. Copy, I repeat, I'm alive. Finally, through the static, a reply broke through, faint but unmistakable. Ranger 27. Confirm location. Copy faintly. Tears pricked her eyes. She grinned despite herself. Coordinates incoming. I can make it to extraction if you guide. A shout outside cut her off. Footsteps thundered toward the tower. She cursed under her breath, yanked the battery free, and killed the lights. The door burst open. 4 men with flashlights and rifles. They fired the moment they saw movement. Bullets tore through the air. Elena dove behind a steel beam, rolled, and returned fire. 2 went down instantly. The 3rd tried to flank her. She met him halfway, using the butt of her rifle like a hammer. The last man fled, shouting for reinforcements. She sprinted out of the tower, clutching the battery to her chest. The alarm siren began wailing. Searchlights flickered on, sweeping the yard. Dozens of men shouted in confusion. She darted behind a pile of crates, her lungs burning. There was no way she could fight them all. She had to escape. She spotted the fuel depot, massive tanks lined up along the far wall. An idea sparked in her mind. She pulled a flare grenade from her vest, her last one. She aimed for the central tank and threw. It clattered once, twice, then burst into flame. The explosion tore through the night like thunder. Fire roared skyward, engulfing vehicles and tents. The men screamed in chaos. Using the distraction, Elena bolted for the outer fence. She vaulted over the debris, ignoring the pain shooting up her leg, and sprinted into the desert as the base behind her burned. She didn't stop running until the lights were nothing but flickering dots behind her. When she finally collapsed in a hollow between dunes, she rolled onto her back, chest heaving, and looked at the stars. The silence was absolute again, but this time it wasn't hopeless. Command had heard her voice. They knew she was out there. Rescue was coming. Still, something inside her had changed. Lying there, under the endless desert sky, she remembered the last thing her mentor, Captain Mason, had told her years ago, the day she earned her ranger cab. A ranger's code isn't about fighting, Elena. It's about never letting anyone write your ending for you, even if it means crawling out of hell to do it. She smiled faintly. He'd been right. She'd crawled out of hell, and she wasn't done yet. The desert wind carried the distant echo of her explosion, a reminder of what she'd survived. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small insignia patch she'd ripped from her uniform. The night she crashed, a silver star and dagger. She stared at it for a long moment before tucking it back against her heart. Tomorrow, she would keep moving east. Command would find her, or she'd find them. Either way, she would finish this, not as a survivor, but as a ranger. She closed her eyes, whispering to the wind. Never outgunned, never outnumbered, never out. Then she drifted into uneasy sleep, the flames of the burning outpost still dancing on the horizon, a beacon of her defiance, glowing bright enough for the world to see. And for the first time since the fall, Elena Ward wasn't running anymore. She was leading the fight. The explosion that consumed the mining camp became a desert legend overnight. Smoke rose for miles, curling into the dawn sky like a signal of vengeance. Villagers whispered that an American strike team had hit the enemy base. But no aircraft had flown overhead. No drone had been seen. Only one woman had walked away from that fire, and the desert began to whisper her name. Elena Ward moved through the mountains of Shamal Valley like a phantom. Her uniform, now stripped of all insignia, blended with the sand. Her rifle, reassembled and cleaned, never left her side. The radio she salvaged from the destroyed outpost buzzed weakly, its battery half dead, but alive enough to keep her connected to something that felt like hope. She didn't speak much anymore. There was no one to talk to. Only the wind and the memory of voices she'd lost in the fall, her team's shouts still echoing in her head. Sometimes, when exhaustion blurred her thoughts, she'd whisper their names, just to remind herself she wasn't entirely alone. But deep down, she knew she had become something else now. Not the woman who fell, but the ghost who wouldn't die. On the 5th day after the explosion, she reached a mountain pass overlooking a narrow valley. Below, through her binoculars, she saw movement. 2 enemy trucks, parked near a dried riverbed. Men were unloading crates, weapons, and ammunition. But what caught her attention wasn't the cargo. It was the radio tower being erected beside it. They were setting up another relay point, probably to replace the one she had destroyed. If that tower went active, they'd triangulate her position and cut her off from command permanently. She needed to stop them before nightfall. She crouched behind a cluster of rocks, scanning their positions, counting guards, watching their movements. There were 12 of them, too many for a direct assault. She had 2 full magazines, 1 grenade, and a handful of flares. Not enough firepower. But Rangers never measured odds. They measured opportunities. She waited for the wind. When the mountain gusts began sweeping dust through the valley, visibility dropped. Men cursed, covering their faces with scarves. Elena slid down the ridge silently, using the noise as cover. Every motion was practiced, each step placed with surgical precision. At the bottom, she found an old irrigation trench, half buried in sand. She crawled through it until she was just a few meters behind the nearest truck. The guards were distracted, shouting at one another over the wind. She pulled a small metal sphere from her pouch, a smoke grenade she had scavenged earlier. Pulling the pin, she tossed it under the second truck. Thick gray smoke billowed instantly. Confusion erupted. Shouts turned into gunfire as the men fired blindly into the haze. Elena used the chaos. She darted between vehicles, firing short, accurate bursts. 2 men fell before they even realized what hit them. Another tried to mount the machine gun on the truck. She took him out with a single shot to the shoulder, sending him spinning. The smoke began to thin, revealing silhouettes moving frantically. She had seconds before they regrouped. She sprinted toward the tower, planted her last grenade at its base, and dove behind a sand dune. The explosion lit the valley like daylight. The tower collapsed, steel bending and snapping like broken bones. The remaining men fled into the hills, shouting for reinforcements. Elena didn't chase. She didn't need to. Her goal was complete. She collected what she could from the wreckage, spare ammo, a canteen, a medkit. Then she disappeared into the mountains again, leaving behind only tracks that the wind quickly erased. By the time night fell, the rumors had already started spreading. Enemy scouts found the ruined camp the next morning, bodies scattered, tower destroyed, no sign of who had done it. One soldier, trembling, told his commander he saw a woman in American fatigues vanish into the cliffs. His commander struck him across the face. "A ghost?" He barked. "You saw a ghost?" But the man insisted. "She moved like wind. I swear it." By the end of the week, Taliban radio intercepts mentioned her by name, or rather, the myth they'd created, the Shadow of Shamal. The woman who couldn't be killed. The one who walked out of explosions and brought storms wherever she went. For Elena, it was both a curse and a weapon. Fear became her camouflage. The more they feared her, the easier it was to move unseen. One night, as she rested in a cave overlooking the valley, her radio crackled faintly. She froze, pressing it to her ear. Ranger 27. If you're receiving, extraction delayed. Hold position. Over. Her heart skipped. Command. They were still searching for her. She clicked her transmitter twice, the signal for copy. Then she heard a faint addition. Intel confirms high-value target nearby. If possible, maintain observation. You're closest. She stared into the dark, disbelief mixing with determination. Even now, wounded, stranded, presumed dead, they still trusted her with the mission. That was the Ranger way. You never stop. You never quit. She whispered to herself, voice steady. Mission first, always. Days later, her patience paid off. From her ridge, she saw a convoy moving at dawn, heavily guarded trucks. 3 motorcycles and a black SUV. Through binoculars, she caught sight of a tall man in traditional robes, surrounded by bodyguards. She recognized his face from old briefings. Suleiman Raji, one of the region's most wanted insurgent leaders. This was the high-value target. Elena exhaled slowly. There would be no second chance. She checked her rifle, aligned the scope, adjusted for wind. The convoy moved slowly across the valley floor. Her finger hovered over the trigger. But before she could fire, her radio hissed again, a different voice this time. Ranger 27, this is Eagle 1. Copy if you can. We're tracking same target. Hold fire, repeat, hold fire. Extraction inbound within 48 hours. She froze. Extraction at last. But it came with a price. She had to wait. The convoy disappeared into the mountains. Elena lowered her rifle, her mind torn between orders and instinct. She wanted to finish this now, to end it with one shot. But she followed orders. That was the Ranger code. Discipline before desire. Still, she marked every trail, every bend, every possible escape route the convoy could take. When her team came, they'd need her intel. She would not let this mission fail. That night, rain swept across the desert, rare, sudden, violent. Elena sat under the mouth of her cave, watching lightning dance along the ridges. Her thoughts drifted to home, the green fields of Virginia, her mother's laugh, the smell of rain on wet soil. It all felt a lifetime away. But she wasn't ready to go back. Not yet. Not until this was over. As thunder echoed through the valley, she whispered softly to herself, Rangers don't die easy. We don't vanish. We endure. And as she spoke, she realized something profound. She wasn't fighting just to survive anymore. She was fighting to prove something bigger. That courage wasn't about bullets or medals. It was about refusing to fade, even when the world thought you were gone. By dawn, her legend had spread further than any radio signal ever could. To her enemies, she was a ghost. To her allies, she was a signal of hope. And to herself, she was finally what the creed had always promised. A ranger leading the way, even in the dark. The storm that swept across the Shamal Mountains didn't end with rain. It left silence. Cold, hollow silence. For days afterward, Elena moved under gray skies, the world damp and heavy with mud. Her boots squelched through wet sand, her rifle cold against her shoulder. She'd spent so long fighting to be heard that now, in the quiet, she almost forgot what she was waiting for. Then it came, a sound she hadn't heard in months. The faint, rhythmic thump of rotor blades. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks, like it had so many times before. But as she lifted her head, the echo grew stronger. Her radio crackled. Ranger 27, this is Eagle 1. We have your beacon. Citrip confirm location. Over. Elena froze. Her breath hitched. It was real. Eagle 1, this is 27, she rasped into the mic. Alive. Coordinates incoming. Hostile presence light recommend hot extraction. Copy that, Ranger. Stand by. Extraction ETA 15 mics. She exhaled sharply, gripping the radio like it was her lifeline. Her heart pounded with disbelief. After weeks of moving, fighting, hiding, they had found her. She climbed to higher ground, waving a flare. The red smoke curled upward into the wind. Far in the distance, she saw the small black dots approaching. 2 UH-60 Black Hawks cutting across the horizon. Her knees almost buckled. Rescue, finally. But the desert had other plans. As the helicopters drew closer, the wind shifted sharply, carrying the distant echo of gunfire. Elena's instincts kicked in instantly. She dropped the flare, scanning the ridge below. Through her scope, she saw them. A column of trucks roaring toward her position. Dust plumes rose behind them. Dozens of armed fighters. Her signal flare had been seen by more than just her allies. Eagle 1, we have enemy movement from the south. I count 30 fighters. She shouted. Copy that, 27. Maintain position. We're coming in hot. The sound of the helicopters thundered above, shaking the valley. Bullets tore through the air as the first wave of militants reached the ridge. Elena fired back, ducking behind rocks. The choppers opened fire, missiles streaking through the dusk and exploding across the sand. The ground shuddered with every blast. She reloaded, fired again, her hands steady despite the chaos. She'd been in dozens of firefights before, but this one was different. This was her fight to end. Then, a streak of smoke in the sky. Her eyes widened. RPG, she yelled. The rocket screamed through the air and slammed into the lead Black Hawk. The explosion lit the sky in orange fire. The helicopter spun violently, blades shattering, before crashing into the valley below in a burst of flame. Elena, get down. A voice screamed through her headset. The second chopper swerved, avoiding debris, hovering low to provide cover fire. Elena sprinted toward the crash site through the chaos, bullets snapping past her. The downed helicopter burned ahead, its crew struggling to crawl free. She dragged one man out, his leg twisted and bleeding, pulling him behind a rock. Stay with me? She shouted. Go! The pilot gasped. They're surrounding us. She looked up. Dozens of fighters were closing in from both sides. Eagle 1, we're overrun. She shouted into the radio. Abort extraction. Repeat abort? But the remaining helicopter refused to leave. It hovered dangerously low, its door gunner laying down suppressing fire. Then, through the haze of smoke and fire, a voice came over the radio, firm, commanding, unshaken. Negative, Ranger 27. We don't leave our own. For a heartbeat, she couldn't move. Those words, we don't leave our own, hit her like a bullet of memory. It was the creed. Her creed. The second helicopter descended, ropes uncoiling. A team of 3 soldiers rappelled down, firing as they landed. Ward, you're coming with us. One shouted. Negative. She shouted back, dragging another wounded man. We've got survivors. Help me get them out first. Together, they pulled 2 crewmen toward the ropes. Gunfire erupted again. One of her rescuers was hit in the shoulder, but kept firing. Elena covered him, her rifle flashing in short, brutal bursts. When the last survivor was lifted, a voice from the helicopter screamed through the headset. Ward, grab the line. Let's go. She turned to run, but then saw it. Another RPG team on the far ridge. Two men kneeling, aiming directly at the extraction bird. "No," she yelled, breaking into a sprint. She fired wildly at them, dropping one. The second launched the rocket. It arced through the smoke, hitting the helicopter's tail. The world exploded. The blast knocked her off her feet, throwing her backward into the dirt. She covered her head as flaming debris rained down around her. When she looked up, the helicopter was spinning out of control, flames trailing from its hull. It smashed into the far side of the valley, fire rolling across the sand. "Eagle 1 is hit. Eagle 1 is down." Her radio screamed with overlapping voices. Command, pilots, static, chaos. Elena crawled behind a boulder, ears ringing, vision blurred. Smoke thickened until she could barely see. Through the haze, enemy trucks swarmed in like vultures. She fired blindly, hitting two, but they kept coming. Then, a sound that froze her blood. The remaining survivors from the first crash were being dragged away. Her chest tightened. She wanted to charge after them, but her body refused. Her leg throbbed with searing pain. Shrapnel had torn through her thigh. Still, she forced herself up, leaning on her rifle like a crutch. She raised her radio again. "Command, this is Ranger 27, she gasped. Extraction failed. Both birds down. Multiple hostiles. Send reinforcements. Coordinates, the radio sputtered, then went dead. The last light of evening faded behind the mountains. The valley burned, black smoke twisting upward into a red sky. The smell of fuel and fire filled her lungs. She dragged herself into the wreckage, checking for survivors. The second pilot was gone. Another soldier still breathed faintly. She ripped her shirt, tied a tourniquet, and pressed her canteen into his hand. "Stay with me," she said quietly. "Ward ... he whispered weakly. You should have left ... She shook her head. "Rangers don't leave anyone, ever." He managed a broken smile before losing consciousness. Elena sat beside him in the flickering light of the flames, her rifle across her knees. The firefight had faded into distant echoes. For the moment, there was only her, one woman among the wreckage of two birds, and the broken bodies of those who had come to save her. Tears welled in her eyes, cutting clean lines through the soot on her face. She had been so close, only minutes away from freedom. And yet, fate had torn it from her again. But in the midst of that loss, something inside her hardened, not despair, but resolve. They hadn't died for nothing. If the enemy thought she was finished, they were wrong. Elena looked up at the burning sky, blood still dripping down her leg, and whispered the creed under her breath. "I will never leave a fallen comrade. I will never falter. I will never fail." The wind picked up, carrying her words into the darkness. As dawn approached, she gathered what supplies she could from the wrecks: a few rounds, a half-full canteen, a single flare. Then, limping heavily, she started walking east, toward the mountains where her enemies waited. She wasn't running anymore. She was coming for them. And behind her, two fires burned like twin beacons in the valley, marking the place where courage met tragedy, and where a lone ranger's war had only just begun. The horizon bled red and gold as the Afghan sun dipped behind the jagged cliffs, painting the mountains like a burning sea. For Sergeant Elena Ward, the world had narrowed down to one instinct: keep moving. Her legs trembled under her, her right arm wrapped tightly with a strip of torn fabric. It was the 5th day since the failed extraction, and she had nothing left but grit and half a bottle of muddy water. Her lips cracked as she whispered to herself, "Rangers lead the way." The words weren't a slogan anymore. They were the only thing keeping her alive. She stumbled along the dry canyon floor, dragging one foot after another. Each step sent pain lancing up through her body, but she couldn't stop. The mountains were crawling with Taliban scouts. They hunted her like an animal, and she knew that if she slowed down, she'd never rise again. By nightfall, she found a hollow in the cliffside. Her breath came in ragged bursts as she collapsed inside, clutching the blood-stained maps tied around her waist. Those maps were her proof, the coordinates of enemy camps, hidden weapon routes, the ambush positions she'd overheard through their radios. She'd memorized every inch of the terrain, turning her survival into reconnaissance. She took out a small shard of metal, the edge of her broken knife, and scratched one more mark on the cave wall. Day 19, she whispered. Still on mission. The wind outside howled like a beast. Elena huddled deeper into the darkness, trying to block out the cold. Her mind began to drift, images flashing like broken film reels. The helicopter explosion. The free fall. The endless silence after hitting the ground. The faces of her squad flashing before her eyes. Diaz, Miller, Thompson, the brothers who'd sworn to have her six. She clenched her fists. "I'll see you soon," she murmured. Not in surrender, but in promise. Her body ached, but her senses stayed razor-sharp. Every rustle of sand, every faint echo of boots in the distance made her pulse quicken. She forced herself to stay awake. Sleep was the enemy. Now sleep meant never waking up again. Hours later, a faint light shimmered outside the cave. A patrol. 2 men, their silhouettes framed against the moonlight, speaking in low tones. She held her breath and pressed against the stone, her hand trembling around the shard of metal. The men paused, one of them turning toward her hiding spot. Her heart stopped. But just as he took a step forward, a distant shout pulled them away. When the echoes faded, she exhaled shakily. That was too close. Her body couldn't take another chase. The next morning, Alana climbed higher into the cliffs, searching for a vantage point. From the ridge, she could see the barren valley below, stretching for miles hostile land, unforgiving and endless. But far in the distance, a shimmer caught her eye. Faint, metallic, glinting beneath the haze. A convoy. Her chest tightened. Could it be American? She dropped to her stomach, pulling the binocular lens she'd scavenged from a broken scope. Dust blurred her vision, but the vehicles moved in formation square silhouettes. Armored, disciplined, U.S. forces. Her heart pounded. She wasn't hallucinating. They were here, her people. But then she saw something else. On the far ridge, where the rocks curved like teeth, enemy fighters were positioning mortar. A trap. Elena's throat went dry. She had no radio, no flares, just her body and a mission. Her legs screamed in protest, but she began to descend the cliff, sliding and stumbling, gripping roots and stones with raw hands. Every minute counted. She'd seen that convoy before. The code on their armored trucks meant Ranger Battalion Delta 9, her own team. A very squad that thought she was dead. She couldn't let them walk into the same kind of hell she'd been crawling through for weeks. By the time she reached the valley floor, her feet were bleeding. She tore strips from her uniform and tied them around her boots. The convoy was still miles away, but she could already hear the faint rumble of engines. The Taliban were waiting in perfect formation like hunters behind a blind. Elena crouched behind a boulder and scanned the ridge. She counted 12 men, 3 mortar, and a single heavy-caliber machine gun pointed straight at the road. It was suicide for her to move closer, but she didn't hesitate. She slid down the slope, inching toward the enemy position. Her movements were deliberate, slow, calculated, predator-like. The sun was at her back, casting long shadows that concealed her silhouette. She waited for the right moment. When the first shell lifted into the air, she sprang. her knife now honed against stone flashed in her grip. She lunged at the nearest fighter, silencing him before the others even turned. Chaos erupted. Bullets cracked through the air, dust exploding around her. She dove for cover, rolled behind a crate, and grabbed the fallen soldier's rifle. Her heart thundered, but her mind was ice cold. She aimed through the scope, lined up on the machine gunner, and squeezed the trigger. One shot and another. The man dropped. The convoy below stopped abruptly, realizing something was wrong. Smoke plumed from the ridge. Elena fired again, hitting the second mortar team. She had no cover now, no backup, but every second she held them off gave her brothers on the road a chance to turn. When her rifle clicked empty, she didn't hesitate. She threw a rock at a nearby mortar shell and dove backward. The explosion ripped through the ridge, sending shockwaves down the mountain. When the dust cleared, Elena lay sprawled on the ground, ears ringing, blood trickling from her temple. She blinked hard, vision spinning. Below, the convoy had turned armored vehicles circling into defensive positions. Helicopters roared overhead, responding to the signal flare one of the soldiers had fired. Through the haze, she saw them, her squad. The same patch, the same insignia. She wanted to call out, but her voice cracked. She tried waving her hand, but the effort drained the last of her strength. She sank against the scorched earth, whispering, "I'm here." Still on mission. Her world faded to black. When she opened her eyes again, it was night. The battlefield was silent, except for the hum of insects and the soft drip of blood from her arm. The convoy was gone. They'd survived, but they hadn't seen her. They thought she was just another ghost of war lost to the valley. Her body refused to move, but her spirit burned brighter than ever. She had done it. She'd saved them, even if no one knew. The stars shimmered above her, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small smile. "One ranger left," she whispered. "That's enough." She crawled into a nearby crevice and wrapped herself in a thermal blanket she'd taken from a dead soldier's pack. The wind carried the faint echo of helicopter blades, fading farther away. She didn't chase them. She didn't cry. She simply stared at the sky until dawn, her eyes filled with quiet pride. Tomorrow, she would move again. Toward home. Toward the line between myth and survival. At Fort Benning, weeks later, they told the story of a mysterious figure who'd saved Delta 9 from an ambush deep in the Chamal Valley. No one could explain how she survived the fall, how she evaded capture, or how she fought alone for nearly a month. Some called it luck. Others called it impossible. But the rangers who had seen the explosions from the ridge swore they'd heard something faint through the static of the radio, a broken, defiant voice repeating the same words over and over. Ranger 27. Still on mission. Still alive. The desert had finally calmed. The sun rose over Chamal Valley, casting a soft golden glow across the burnt remains of the outposts and the jagged mountains beyond. But one presence was gone, or so everyone thought. Sergeant Elena Ward had disappeared once more into the wilderness, limping, bleeding, exhausted but alive. Command had counted her dead after the failed extraction. Delta 9 had mourned her. Her squad had pinned her face on the mission board, remembering her as a casualty. They didn't know the truth, that the ranger they believed lost was still walking, still breathing, still fighting. She moved through the mountains with precision, every step measured, every breath calculated. Her injuries screamed with pain, but her body obeyed her will alone. The desert wind carried the scent of burned metal from the downed helicopters and scorched convoy. It reminded her of how close she had come to death, and how fragile life really was. Command had sent search parties into the valley. Rangers, special forces, and local assets scoured the canyons and ridges, tracking the faint traces of her movement. Every camp she passed had been wiped clean or avoided entirely, leaving no footprints behind. She had become more than human, more than myth. She had become a ghost of the Shamal Valley. Her mind kept replaying the last moments of the extraction. The second Black Hawk destroyed, the surviving crewmen pulled from the flames, the enemy converging on her position. She remembered every moment, the pain, the fire, the hopelessness. And yet, she hadn't given up. The Ranger creed pulsed in her veins. Never leave a fallen comrade. Never quit. Never fail. It was more than survival now. It was purpose. She paused on a ridge, gazing at the valley below. The enemy convoy she had disrupted weeks ago was gone. But more convoys would come. She could hear their chatter, the faint metallic hum of distant trucks and engines through the hills. It was a world built for war, and she had become a force no one could predict. By nightfall, Elena found an abandoned shepherd's hut perched on the edge of a cliff. She crawled inside, pulling her pack close. The fire she built from dry twigs was small, barely giving light, but it gave warmth. She cleaned her wounds as best she could, using rags torn from her uniform. Her mind wandered, as it often did, to the team she had lost. Diaz, Miller, Thompson all gone. She had carried the weight of their deaths silently, their faces haunting her through every step. She pressed her hand to the small insignia she kept in her pocket, a silver star and dagger, a reminder of her training, her family, her identity as a ranger. "I'm still here," she whispered. "I'm still on mission." The next day brought a sight she hadn't expected. From a distant ridge, she saw the unmistakable glint of an American convoy moving through the valley floor. Delta 9 had arrived. They were here to extract her, or at least to find what remained of her trail. Elena's heart clenched. Relief, fear, pride. She wasn't the same ranger they had trained with. Months of evasion, months of fighting alone, had changed her. She had become sharper, harder, and more capable than anyone could have imagined. She chose her moment carefully. Waiting until the convoy passed a narrow defile, she descended from her perch like a shadow. In the valley below, enemy fighters had set up a makeshift checkpoint oblivious to her presence. She moved with calculated speed. One by one, she neutralized them silently. A blow to the temple, a slash with her knife, a throw of a captured grenade into the supply crates. Chaos erupted, but she wasn't there to linger. She needed to meet her team alive, not dead. Delta 9's squad had stopped at the checkpoint, weapons ready, scanning the hills. Then they saw her emerging from the smoke and rubble. Blood-streaked, battered, her uniform torn, a rifle slung over her shoulder. At first, they froze. "Ward?" One voice whispered, trembling. "Yes," she said simply, voice hoarse but unwavering. "I'm here." Still on mission. The squad's disbelief turned into awe. They ran to her, embracing her, checking her injuries, praising her survival. She waved them off. This wasn't about glory. It was about completing the mission, ensuring no one else would suffer like she had. Over the next few days, she debriefed with command. She delivered intelligence gathered from months in enemy territory, hidden supply routes, insurgent hierarchies, and critical positions that had gone unnoticed for years. Every detail she provided was precise, actionable, and deadly accurate. Her survival had become an intelligence asset, greater than any drone or satellite could provide. And yet, she didn't speak of the nights she'd spent crawling through the desert, of the hunger, the dehydration, the bullet wounds, and burns. Those moments were hers alone. She didn't need validation. She only needed to live. The story of Sergeant Elena Ward spread quickly through the ranks. To her fellow Rangers, she was a symbol of unbreakable will, a testament that no fall was fatal, no obstacle insurmountable. To her enemies, she became a phantom one that haunted nightmares and radio chatter alike. Ghost of Shamal Valley, they whispered. Impossible. A woman who walks through fire and steel and never dies. Elena herself never claimed the title. She didn't need it. The creed had carried her through every impossibility. She had fallen, survived, fought, and now she had returned not as a hero in medals, but as a ranger in truth. Weeks later, back on American soil, she stood at the edge of a training ground at Fort Benning. She watched new recruits drill, young men and women learning the basics of survival, discipline, and courage. She saw herself in them, determined, untested, full of life and fire. Her commander approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sergeant Ward," he said softly, "you've done more than survive. You've inspired an entire battalion. Your story will be taught for years." She shook her head. "I didn't do it for a story," she said. "I did it because that's what Rangers do. We don't quit. We don't leave anyone behind. That's it." And yet, even as she spoke, she knew the legend would follow her. Not because she wanted it, but because the impossible she had achieved couldn't be ignored. That night, Elena sat quietly in her barracks. The sounds of Fort Benning footsteps, laughter, distant drills were comforting. She traced the silver star on her uniform with her finger, thinking of the months she had survived alone. A soft smile crossed her face. She had fallen. She had burned. She had been counted among the dead. And yet here she was, still standing, still fighting, still alive. Her reflection in the window showed a woman transformed. The desert had taken its toll on her body, but her eyes burned brighter than ever. They held the fire of a ranger who had faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. For Sergeant Elena Ward, survival was no longer about returning home. It was about proving that the creed she lived by was real. That a ranger didn't need parachutes, helicopters, or luck to survive. They needed only courage. And she had enough for a lifetime. The legend of the Shamal ghost was born not from tales of violence or destruction, but from the unshuckable truth that one person, refusing to give up, could rewrite fate itself. And somewhere deep in her soul, Elena whispered to herself, as she had countless times in the desert, "Mission complete. Not for me, but for all who couldn't finish." Rangers lead the way, always. The mountains outside lay silent now. The fires had burned out. The ghosts had fled. And one ranger, the impossible survivor, had returned to tell the story.